Dawn came gray and grudging, the light the color of old steel, flattening the earth and the ranks upon it as if a great hand had pressed everything into stillness. The frost in the grasses lay in a thin crust that broke under hoof and boot with soft snaps, the sound all but lost beneath the whispering of the wind. Jon drew the chill into his lungs and let it out slow, watching it plume in front of him. Winterfell sat black and stubborn in the west, the walls inked against a sky that had not yet decided if it would clear or snow. A crow passed overhead and gave a harsh cry that spun and skittered over the plain, and for a moment he could not shake the feeling that it carried some omen in it, some shape of what would come to pass once steel began to sing. He could taste iron in the air already, as if the day had nicked its lip and was bleeding unseen. Behind him the wildlings muttered, the cadence of the free folk clattering against the more careful hush of northern voices. Davos Seaworth stood near his right knee, hunched in his cloak, face wind-chapped and steady, seeing. Tormund squinted at the distant lines that were lining up across from them, Bolton pink banners bright and awful against the gray, the flayed men surprising in their cheerfulness, like ribbons on a noose. Ugly flags, Tormund said. They think ugliness frightens us. I've seen worse painted on a camp latrine. Davos let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another life. If ugliness won fights, Stannis would have broken them all. Jon did not smile. The weight of Longclaw at his hip felt like a cold truth. He looked to his sister, seated on her small horse a little behind the front. Sansa's hair was knotted up tight. The copper of it could have been a coal needing the smallest breath to flare. Her chin had a new shape, not her mother's and not the girl he had seen running down Winterfell's courtyards with needles and thread and Arya's shouted laughter on her heels. She had written letters in the night by candlelight, the flames gilding her cheekbones and making her eyes into coins that showed one face to him and another to someone far away. She had said Ramsay would play a game because that was what he was, a man-shaped appetite for games. He would not simply crash his force into theirs. He would play at it and try to slide a hook into Jon's heart to draw him forward. There will be a trap, she had said to him in the dark with the tent flaps whispering. He cannot help it. It is his pride. And ours? He had asked then. What is ours? Patience, she had said, and he had almost laughed because the Starks had not often been patient. They weathered or they broke. Patience was something that happened to them, not something they held. But she had set her hand on his knuckles, where the scars were pale and tight, and he had found something like patience in that. Now he felt for it again. Between their lines, stretching like uncut cloth, lay the open ground where men would die. Ramsay Bolton sat on a dark horse with his pale face and his dark hair and that little knot smile, as if a joke had just been told only he could hear. To his left, broad shoulders, a thick neck, a beard that made his face look shorter. Small Jon Umber's men formed up, bows black and sleek. Karstark men were there too, lean and grim, their lords having chosen the side that seemed to put bread on the table, as hungry men always did. Jon felt Ghost before he saw him, that soundless slide at the edge of vision, white as if he were a hole torn in the world through which snow was peeping. Ghost pressed his great head under Jon's hand and huffed, breath warm, eyes red as banked coals. Jon scratched the thick fur at the base of his ear. We hold, he said quietly. We hold until we don't. Tormund glanced at him sidelong. You ready to give up your pride for a trick, Crow? Jon's mouth thinned. I led men who thought tricks were sin and died anyway for it. Today we sin. They had talked through it, hours of rough maps traced in ash on a shield's back. The ground walked and walked again until Davos said he could draw it with his eyes closed. The center would seem to step forward and falter, as if courage had slid slickly out of it. The horse would move as if they were unsure, their edges would fray, and then at the right moment a horn would call and they would fall back, not in panic but in a shape that invited anyone greedy enough to follow to come too far. The plain had a slight fall to it midway to the river, a low strip of soft ground where drainage had kept the frost from biting deep. If the Bolton horse came fast there, they would churn it and slow, and the wildling spears could find them. That alone was nothing to trust. They were outnumbered and outhorsed. But the rest was built like a trap of light and dark, to show Ramsay a piece of fear he could not resist and to hide behind it the steel they still had. If it failed, they would all be bones in a week and Winterfell's walls would mock them under a fresh set of flayed ornaments. A movement rippled along the front of the Bolton line. A shape, small and slight, was led out. Jon did not breathe. He could not. He had seen the boy only in his mind for years, small as firelight seen through shutters. Rickon had their father's long face and their mother's eyes, but both were sobered by hunger and fright. His hair had grown until it fell around his shoulders in rough strands, not the wolfish black of Jon's but brown like Sansa's, like Arya's, like the women in their line. A rope was looped around his wrists. When the rope was cut free he flinched, looking at Ramsay as if any sudden move might bring a strike. Ramsay smiled. He put a hand on the back of Rickon's neck and bent to say something into his ear, and whatever he said made the boy's jaw set in a way that made Jon's throat ache. Rickon looked across the field. He looked at Jon as if there were nothing else to hold on to in the whole world. "Don't," Sansa said, her voice so even it was nearly flat at his back, and he knew somehow she had seen his breath change. "Let him do it. Let him show every teeth he has before you decide which to break." Ramsay pointed to Jon then, theatrical as a juggler in a market square, and made a gesture with his hand. Across, run, little dog, go fetch your master." The rope dropped from Rickon's hands. He ran. He ran with the stiff, driven run of someone whose choices have collapsed to one thin line. A hum rose from the Bolton side. Bows lifted. Jon exhaled, and in the space between that breath and the next he lifted his gauntlet hand to shoulder height and tipped it, as if he were loosening a bit of the morning off its hinges. Davos did not look at him. He only lifted his own hand to the horn carrier with a scarred nod. Tormund grinned a fox grin that showed a ragged bite of teeth. The horn sounded once, long and low, an unlovely note that dragged across the plain. In the stark center, the front rank lifted, not with a cheer but in a ripple of motion that looked unconfident, men's feet scuffing the frost. The horse moved forward at a walk and then a trot that looked too slow even for a show. Jon let his own horse step into that rhythm, wooden and imperfect, and in them all there was a show of fear that was almost no show at all. The old, grim wisdom of the free folk settled over them, a willingness to look fool enough to live. Ramsay's smile held. He lifted his hand. The archers tensed and bent. On the stark right, a knot of riders, their shields bare of sigils, peeled away as if they had lost their nerve entirely and were separating to flee. The Bolton line breathed a little deeper. The first arrows rose, but even as they left strings, even when the black sewing of them lifted to unspool towards that small figure running, there came a second horn, sharp as a snapped bone, and the bare-shield riders did as they had been told a dozen times by lamplight and in whispers. They spurred forward, kicked up a low storm of frost and earth, and lifted their round shields, not to their own protection but to angle the long boards into a moving wall, the edges overlapping. It was a poor workman's pavis, ugly and hasty, but it turned the first scatter of arrows. The shields shuddered, quivered like struck drums. Ramsay's head cocked. The little knot smile cracked a fraction wider. He lifted his hand again and the archers waited, but the Bolton horse to his left were milling now, men leaning forward in their saddles, hungry, muttering that the enemy was breaking. "Look, their fear is a stink on them." A short man in an umber cloak half raised his saber and dropped it again, twitching with impatience. Ramsay laughed at something only he heard and made a flick with his hand that could have been a dismissal as easily as a command. The archers shifted their aim to the notches in the shield wall to pick at, but another knot of Stark horse peeled away to the left and guided their mounts into a shallow arc that ran crosswise. The ground there was a little higher, and when they came across it at an angle, they naturally threw up more dust, more light earth, more obfuscation, and the archers hesitated again. Men are careful when they have something to win more than something to lose. Small hesitations bloom where greed creeps in. Jon, meanwhile, had let his horse step into a canter that looked like a trot at a distance. He leaned forward, knees hard into the animal's ribs. Ghost went by him like a thought, silent and sure, closer to the ground than any horse, arrow thin and arrow fleet. Rickon stumbled, caught himself, ran. The first arrow that got past the makeshift shields hissed by a pace to his right. Another stuck up in the turf so close to his heel he kicked it as he passed. He did not zigzag. He ran with the logic of fear, a straight line between life and death. Ghost came in from the side, a white blur that took on shape at the last second, and shouldered the boy hard at the knee. Rickon fell, rolled, scrambled to his hands. For an instant the odd collision had skipped him a half step out of the path of an arrow that would have cut his throat. It buried itself in the earth where his neck had been, the feathers shivering. "Now," Jon said to the air, though the horn call that answered had been agreed on 2 hours ago. The center had pushed just far enough. The feint had ripened to the point where another stroke would rot it. The third horn brayed, and the forward push faltered all at once. Men stepping back and then back again, that deceit turned sacrament, making a fall into a deliberate thing. Men on the Bolton side cheered aloud. Their horse took the bite that had been dangled. Ramsay had wanted this. He wanted them senseless and charging, wanted Jon alone in the middle of the world, an easy figure for arrows. But greed and a kind of delighted malice often dressed as confidence. When the stark line fell away and the riders on the flanks tore off, throwing dust and doubt, Ramsay gestured as if he were finishing a joke, and his cavalry thundered forward. Their archers held their fire. Any man who has seen a horse run knows better than to put his shafts into his own men's backs. There was enough dust kicked up now to make fine work foolish. The Bolton cavalry toppled into the low ground like a wave into a trough. Their speed died a little, then some more. Hooves sank to the fetlocks. Jon's horse stretched under him. The ground hammered his legs. He could see Rickon's eyes now, 2 points swimming in a dirty face. Ghost had planted himself between the boy and the worst of the field. The direwolf's back was ridged, his lips drawn to show tooth, the sound that came out of him too low for a bosun's whistle but with the same unarguable command. Arrows came still but fewer and wider. Someone on the Bolton side shouted, "Hold! Hold! There's our own." And then it was too late for half the men to hear. Jon leaned, reached. His gauntlet closed on the cheap wool of Rickon's tunic and was sliding when the boy caught at his arm with both hands. A child's grip relearned under terror. The horse shied under the unequal weight. Jon hauled, throat open with a sound he would not have recognized as his own, and Rickon came up against his thigh, his weight lurching, his boots skidding over the horse's ribs. Ghost spun in a neat half-circle at the same moment and snapped at the nearest horse coming too fast. A savage warning that made the animal scream and sheer off. Jon found the back of Rickon's belt and pulled, set him hard in front of his own saddle, and at once threw himself forward over the boy, body curled, back to the Boltons, making of his shoulders and armor a shelter. Rickon was quick, athletic. He had been thin all his life and had learned to be strong inside it. He threw his arms around Longclaw's scabbard and clung, head tucked. The center of the stark line had continued to collapse in outward form but inward logic. They curled back on themselves like a leaf in heat, an inward roll that left a gap between two bold-looking teeth. The Bolton cavalry poured into that gap shouting until they hit the churned ground and the wildling pikes that thrust suddenly up like young pines where there had been only scrub. Men screamed. Horses reared, came down on other horses. Tormund bellowed in his own language and drove his spear into a mount's shoulder, then met its rider with his fist where a man meets a fist and breaks. To the far left, Davos had put the archers on one knee and then the other, sending up ragged volleys not at any individual but at the heaviest masses of gray and pink, like a fisherman throwing a net where seawater boiled white. The arrows did not win the fight, but they kept a little wind in it, and when they fell they made men duck, and men who duck do not charge so well. Jon turned his horse with his knees, because his hands were full of his brother. He did not have to tell Ghost to come. Ghost came. Arrows made a whisking sound near his ear that did not sound like any kind of music. The plan had been to draw them forward and then take them when they were committed to the terrible work of changing their minds. Plans are lies that you teach yourselves to believe until you are forced to stop. This one, for the length of 2 breaths and then 3, kept on lying for him. Behind him he heard the first cracking of the trap's second tooth. A horn blew from the north, thin and high. A handful of Stark horse that had peeled off earlier to the left now wheeled with their scruffy shields held low and dashed straight across the mouth of the Bolton thrust. Men who thought they were pursuing began to find pursuit hedged about with obstacles. One rider fell with a cry, his horse rolling over him, leg broken under the weight. "Jon!" Tormund's voice carried, snarled through a dozen bodies. "Get the pup in!" Jon did not look back. He did not have to. He could feel the shape of the field the way a man feels a room in which he has lived for years when he walks through it in the dark. The giantesque shape of one moved in the chaos with a terrible grace that never ceased to wound Jon's heart with its beauty. The giant stooped to lift a horse and rider as if they were a bundle of sticks, hurled them aside. An arrow stuck in one's shoulder and quivered. He reached for it and broke it off as if it were a nettle stalk. They reached their own ranks and a slot opened for them, created by men with shields who took 2 steps back in unison. The formation closing again as Jon's horse plunged through. Hands reached to steady Rickon, to pull him down and through and away. Jon slid to the ground after and almost fell as his feet struck earth. He found the boy's shoulder and then his cheek, cool under dirt. He could not help himself. He held Rickon's face in both hands for one heartbeat and then another, and the boy's eyes filled at last. He had not wept when he ran. He wept now because being held is a permission that unlocks everything. "Go with them," Jon said roughly, gesturing to the interior. His voice shook. "Down. Away. You do as Sansa says." Rickon's nod was jerky and fierce. He touched Jon's bracer, a child's touch brief and consecrating, and then he was gone with a pair of men-at-arms who would have let their own hearts be cut out before they let a hair on his head be singed. Ghost vanished with him, a pale storm disappearing into smoke. The noise swelled. Jon turned back into it and found Longclaw in his hand. The Valyrian steel moved perfectly, not because it was magic, though a man can think so once it has saved him a dozen times, but because it had been made for men who live where killers grow like thistles. A Bolton rider thundered at him, and he cut at the horse's nose rather than the man. A cruel stroke, but an effective one. The horse tossed its head and veered, the rider swearing, and then Davos's archers sent a small flock of arrows into the man's shoulder and thigh and hip, and he slid off backwards with surprise written across his mouth like a smear of food. They held the mouth of the Bolton charge and held again. The wildling lines did not break because they had broken 1,000 times already and had learned how to be pieces of a bigger shape. Even as the Boltons pushed, more men in flayed man colors were coming up from the second rank behind, thinking to join a rout and finding instead the sour work of pushing a fight that is already going wrong. And then there came a sound like ice shearing on a lake. All the small sounds were blunted by it. Jon looked up, sweat stinging his eyes, and saw to the south a glimmering line moving along the edge of the crest field. The sun had finally found its way through a thin rent in the cloud and struck on polished steel and polished helms and a flood of pennants, blue and white. The falcon and moon climbed a dozen small banners, taller than crows, taller than excuse, and rode. The Knights of the Vale came on as if they had been waiting behind a curtain while some dull farce finished. And now it was time for the real play. Sansa's breath went out of her then. Jon heard it as a memory of the night rather than the sound itself. Littlefinger's men did not come immediately into the thick of it, because they were not fools. They wheeled to the Bolton right and pushed a wedge into the side of the charge that had been tunneling towards the Stark center, and the energy bleeding from that charge bled faster. Men who had thought themselves the hammer found themselves the nail under a cleverly placed press. Lord Yon Royce rode at their fore with a banner in the crook of his arm and a look like the memory of a colder winter. Ramsay Bolton's not smile changed not at all, but his neck shifted and a muscle in his jaw made a small cameo of him for an instant, a tighter carving under the skin. He called something to his guard, and a message ran down his line. The Bolton pikes moved forward from the second rank and began to lock themselves into a hedgehog. If he could turn his cavalry's failed exploitation into a stationary, ugly knot around which others would flinch, he might still make a thing of it. Jon felt the fight change under his boots. Tormund snarled and spat blood. "He intends to make a turtle in the middle and edge his spears out," he said, startling Jon for a blink that Tormund had seen it, because men who fight long enough come to understand what any animal understands. How a creature curls into itself when it is being hurt. Don't let him, Jon said. And then there was no time for any more words because a Karstark axeman had come up in front of him and screamed his house name and hammered at Jon's shield like a man trying to wake a sleeper. Jon took the axe on the rim and showed the man Longclaw's edge as a way of saying he was awake enough. On the far left, a new sound rose, a confused surge as gray banners hesitated and dipped. Jon caught glimpses between heads and shoulders of Umber men turning their helms toward a small break in the fight. A boy had come to the front there. He had been born 8, 9, 10 winters ago at most, and he was standing on the shield of a dead man bellowing in a voice that had not yet learned to break. "Small Jon," he screamed. "Small Jon, you craven thief. You said we'd have the Stark boy. Well, he's there and nothing you do will carve him into bread." It was not strategy. It was insult woven into a child's fury. It had weight because men are stories told to each other around fire, and this was a story turned back on its teller. Small Jon Umber looked and saw Rickon, hair dirty, face streaked, flanked by 2 men of Winterfell's house guard. His mouth hard as jet. Small Jon's throat moved. He said something Jon couldn't hear, and then he lifted his axe and faced his own line as if a new enemy had sprung from the ground at his feet. Cracked. Not cleanly. Nothing that day cracked cleanly. But a fissure ran in the place where Umber loyalty had been nailed into Bolton wood. Some men hesitated. Some broke the other way and came on with their faces white and sick like men walking out of a fire they had set themselves. Ramsay's head turned again, and the little smile got brighter, which was almost a tell in itself. He took pleasure in difficulty as other men took pleasure in wine. But even those who love hard problems know when their sums are going long. He pulled back a short distance with his guard and began to edge his horse towards Winterfell's gate, which had stood open like a tongue in a mouth wanting to taste what the teeth were chewing. "Go," Sansa said, close by Jon's shoulder, which startled him and then steadied him, because she had come forward where the pieces of the plan had cut and fit. "Let him run. The castle is ours. He is dead when the gate closes, whether he knows it yet or no." They pushed. One came up with a sound like a wave collapsing a cliff and struck the half-formed hedgehog of pikes with his shoulder, took 3 in his chest, and kept walking. He did not roar. He made a steady sound like someone pulling a heavy cart through sand. Arrows grew from him in places with the inevitability of moss on a rock. A single massive step at the last carried him near enough the gate for his hand to find the top of the portcullis and shake it like a toy. The men under it scattered because they were not insane. The iron teeth scraped and shrieked. Jon fought his way to one side with a handful of men and put his shoulder to a flanking door. The Vale Knights funneled into the inner yard with an efficiency that had a brittle edge. They were used to looking fine at tourneys, but the morning was making something else out of them. Davos shouted orders hoarsely and was obeyed not because he had the right blood but because he had the right voice in a fight. Ramsay backed his horse, then wheeled it and put 3 arrows into one, all quick, all cruel and all well placed, one in the eye. One's open hand came down on the yard's hard-packed floor like a fallen tree. Jon bowed his head for one breath. It is important not to steal the honors of the dead by pretending not to feel them, and then advanced face blank. Ramsay smiled at him, a real smile at last. "Let us end this amuse." Jon did not hear the end of his word. He did not give Ramsay language. He closed the distance between them and their blades gave each other the morning's only true greetings. Ramsay was quick enough and taught enough to be dangerous. He slashed with accuracy. Jon took one sting on his rib and another across the meat of his upper arm that might leave him stiff in the evening, if he had an evening. He let anger run through him like water through a sieve. He did not drink it, he let it empty and leave him clean. At last he put Ramsay on his back, Longclaw's point at his throat. He could have pushed the blade down and watched the light go out in those eyes like a lamp at midnight. He did not. He struck him once, twice with the pommel, and other hands were there, Vale hands and Winterfell hands, to take the man at wrists and ankles and drag him, flailing towards the kennels. His hounds were lean and educated and loved him in the way that animals love the hands that bring them meat. Sansa asked for the key, her voice without a tremble. She stood by as the men opened the kennel gates, and for a moment there was a stutter of scents on the air. Meat and hay and old fur and urine and a sweetness that was probably rot. And she did not flinch. Ramsay's smile flickered and fluttered like something trapped in a jar and dying. "You can't," he said, and suddenly he was a boy caught at mischief. "You!" Sansa looked at the hounds. They stepped forward and then back, held by training. "He starved them," she said to the handlers, and the men nodded, eyes down. "Do you think they can be brought back? It isn't their fault." The handlers looked at each other. The older said, "Given a better man to work them." Sansa nodded. "Then none of this?" she said with a flick of her eyes towards the pen's interior. "Take him to the Godswood. He'll die there as he should, where the old names listen. With a rope and not a spectacle. We do not do spectacles in Winterfell." Ramsay laughed then, high and scornful, because shame is often more frightening to those who do not know it than pain. But he did go white. The men took him. Sansa watched him go with her hands banded together in front of her waist, and Jon stood beside her, a half-step behind. "Thank you," he said. She did not look at him. She nodded once. "You listened," she said. "No one listened to me for so long I almost forgot how to speak. You listened." Outside, the sky had pulled itself thinner and the sun had found a way to break on the snow that had formed in the cracks of the field while they fought. Those tiny pieces that look like stars when they melt on the tongue. The yard stank of sweat and iron and old straw, the smell of every yard after a battle. Men moved as if they remembered their own names again and could decide what to do with their hands. Rickon came to them at the foot of the stairs that climbed to the hall. He was flanked still, fiercely, though he no longer stumbled. His face was as exhausted as a field, but there was a line in his mouth that was Dalton Stark's, that old stubbornness that had been in their father when he told a truth to a king because there was nothing else he knew how to do. Rickon stopped 3 paces away and bowed, which was wrong and right at once, then ran the 3 paces and flung himself into Sansa so hard she staggered and then held him. He smelled of the field and the kennel, and Sansa's cheek lay against the top of his head as if she could inhale it away. She kissed him once, on the top of his filthy hair as if it were court, and then again on his temple as if it were home. Jon put his hand on the back of Rickon's neck for a moment, a brief pressure he hardly remembered releasing. He ought to have said, "You are taller," or "I missed you," or something wise that would make the boy's fear seem smaller. He found that wise things sat like stones in his throat. He had never been a man of speeches. Davos came to him in the shadow of the hall's doorway. "It is done?" he asked in a low voice. "In the Godswood," Jon said. "The old gods can hear us if we lie. We will not lie today." Davos nodded, his eyes restless. He had something and was working his way to it with the patience of a man pulling a splinter. Jon waited because he had learned from Davos that to force is to break. "The Red Woman," Davos said. "I found something you should see." He uncurled his fingers, and in them lay a bent length of blackened wood twisted into a stag's shape. The paint had bubbled and split. Jon felt cold, not from the day. The small face had been eaten by fire. He thought of the girl's slight shoulders, the gentleness in her difficult smile. "Bring her to me when it's time," he said. "After the dead are counted." Sansa looked over as Davos moved away and saw the shape in Jon's eyes as plainly as she would have seen a bruise. "What weight is that?" she asked quietly once they were alone, for as much as anyone is alone on a day like that. "An old one," he said. He touched Longclaw's hilt. "Not ours, but it fell on us all the same." "We have many that are ours," she said, looking past him to where the bodies were being sorted into piles, friends and enemies both. "We should not pick up others if we can help it." He wanted to tell her about the wall of cold he had seen in death, the hands in darkness, the weight of the worlds will turning. He said instead, "You were right. He would play a game. We had to be patient." Her mouth warmed, a small thing that made her face younger and older at the same time. "You were right too," she said. "Pride is not always sin. Sometimes it is a way a house remembers its name." She looked at Rickon. "He'll need us. I don't know that I know how to be needed and not used." "We will learn," Jon said. He tried to believe it as he said it. He tried and found himself closer to it than he had been. "We will learn because there is no other thing ahead of us." They sat the victory that evening between them like something fragile, as if it might step off the table and go wandering if they turned their heads. Men came and set down names and left to sleep or drink. Lyanna Mormont stood before them like a nettle plant, sharp and of this soil, and told them they had done well and also foolishly, and that House Mormont had stood alone long enough and would not again. It made Jon's mouth twitch into a grin he quickly smoothed away. A woman from House Hornwood brought a round loaf under her arm as if it were a baby. She left the bread and bowed without lowering her eyes to any man. Later, in the hall with the fire eating its way slowly through logs and the light easing the sharpness of the stone, the lords debated. Some raised their voices to call Jon the king in the north, some to call Rickon the lord of Winterfell. Sansa said nothing for a long time and then lifted her hand. She did not need to speak long to be heard. The room had learned to go still for her when she opened her mouth. "We have a long night coming," she said simply. "The dead do not care for crowns. My brother Rickon is the Stark in Winterfell and will be raised to the work with all the honor that carries. My brother Jon is the sword we put in the door. He will be our warden until Rickon is of age, and more, he will be our voice when steel must speak. When the night comes, you will want the voice that has been to the wall and back." There were murmurs, some heated. Littlefinger's mouth did some contemplative thing, measuring. Jon Royce's eyes went to Jon and then to the fire as if he were testing the truth of both. Lyanna Mormont said in her small, ferocious voice, "We follow the north. The north is this pack. The pack is these two. That is the end of it." It took a while for that to die to a settled thing. In the end it did, because the North learned long ago to listen to girls with voices like winter branches and to boys whose hands had held steel with steadiness. Rickon was stood up in front of the hearth with Sansa's hand on his shoulder and Jon a half-step behind, and lords came to give their names back to the house that had been these lands' bone. Jon felt each pledge land on him like a thrown cloak, warm and heavy and full of old smells. He had never liked weight. He found that this weight made his breath mostly easier except when it did not. There was a small quiet afterwards when the hall had emptied of the loudest of them. Davos came and set the broken stag down on the table with the carefulness one uses with grief. Melisandre stood under the shadow of the door like an image on a painted window and came forward only when summoned. The red of her hair was less aflame tonight than iron sinking in embers. Jon did not shout. Davos did. The story of the child came out of him like something pulled with a barbed hook. Melisandre did not deny, which was a grace or a perversion of it. "You raise people from ashes," Davos said finally, voice hoarse. "Do you think that pays for making them?" Melisandre looked at Jon then with her strange colorless eyes. "I saw Snow," she said. "I saw a man who would fight the dark or die and rise and fight again. I lied to hold the pieces to their shape. That is the work of every priest and every liar." "You'll go south," Jon said. He was so tired he felt as if he could lie down on the bench and sleep for a week, and yet his eyes were too bright. "If you come back to the north, we'll hang you with the others who lie with ropes." She bowed. "It is better than burning," she said, and her mouth slanted, and for a heartbeat, he pitied the wood the world had made her into. She left. The hall exhaled. When the godswood took Ramsay, it did it without thunder. The rope creaked like an old door and stopped. He did not struggle much. When it was done, Sansa stood under the boughs and looked up at the face of the weirwood, and Jon thought she was thinking of all the faces that had knelt and whispered and cried, and he thought it right that some things endure even when the snowflakes are not the same as yesterday's. Rickon slept curled like a fox a few feet from where Ghost had thrown his weight, his cheek pressed into the direwolf's ribs, his fingers curled in fur. When Jon looked in on him in the middle of the night, not even knowing why he had risen from his blankets, he thought of Bran and Arya and a boy in a tower who had fallen and lived, and a girl with a needle for a sword. He thought of their father's voice in the yard and the sound their mother had made once when she thought no one watched and she laid her forehead against the old stone of the gate. He thought of the wall and the black that no longer fit his shoulders and of a hand so cold you could hear it crack when it moved. the hand that would come for them all if they gave it the right with their fighting. He put his hand lightly on Rickon's head, and the boy did not wake, but his breath shifted, as if something had reached him from a long distance and eased a knot. The day that followed dawned clear and cruelly bright. They buried their dead in long straight rows under a sky that at last was blue enough to hurt. One's grave took longer. Men who did not know how to sing in the free folks' way stood around awkwardly, while Tormund said a few words that sounded like laughter had fallen into his throat and not found a way out again until it turned into something else. When they came to cover the giant's face with earth, Tormund looked at Jon and said, "He liked you, Crow. You were small and stubborn." Jon swallowed a clump of feeling and nodded. "He saved my life," he said, which was too little, and yet there wasn't more one can say of any of the dead besides true. At noon the ravens lifted from the rookery in a black gust. Messages went to houses that would need their names caught again on paper to remind them who they were. Sansa drafted a few herself with her sharp, careful hand. She spoke to servants in a voice that made even the most hardened of them remember they had once loved doing their work well. She walked the old places and put them into their old shapes. There were women in the kitchens who wept discreetly when she passed, because they remembered a girl with pretty feet and a tumble of hair who had been kind, and because being kind in grief is a sort of flame. Jon went to the yard and watched the boys of Winterfell, some with the lean cheeks of men who had already stood a line, some with baby fat yet, strike at the pell. He corrected a boy's grip, repositioned his feet. His voice was softer than their father's had been. He had learned softer after he died and come back and found that shouting does not carry across the grave. He told them what the field had shown him, that a feigned retreat is a truth wearing a mask, that men who chase are hungrier than those who hold, that pride can be a blade but also a scabbard, and knowing when to sheathe is as much our business as knowing when to draw. They listened because it was not a story that made them heroes in it, only men with a job to do. When evening came, the light was poured like water across the winter town and the yards, making the roofs shine as if they had been polished in a giant's sleeve. Jon stood on the battlement for a long time and did not know what he looked for. Sansa joined him after a while, wrapped in a fur that made her small again. They looked northwest, where the wall lay, and farther, where a cold older than names was mustering itself. "You were thinking of going," she said softly. "Yes," he said. "No." "Yes." She nodded, not smiling. "You will," she said. "Not today. When the ravens return with ink that says what we already know, that the dead have moved, you will go. And I will hold this and make it ready for you to come back to. We will not be like we were. We cannot be. That girl is dead, Jon. That boy too. We will be worse in one way and better in another." "Better is a large word," he said. "A large word for small x," she answered. "Do you think Father imagined us here when he taught you to throw a stick and taught me to hold a spoon without dribbling?" "He imagined only that we would do as we could," Jon said. "He imagined that with love." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Would you do it the same? The feint?" He looked down at his hands as if the plan might be written there in scars. "Yes, it was the only door open to us. I would do it and do it better." "You saved him," she said, and he heard the small tremor in it, like a plucked string that had finally been touched. "You saved him, and I almost lost you for it. But we did not lose you. The gods are not always cruel. They are old," Jon said. "Old things do not think of us as we wish." They stood there until their breath was smoke and their feet had numbed. Behind them, in the hall, Rickon slept with Ghost and dreamed toddler dreams for a few hours until fear found him and turned them strange. On the far side of the world, perhaps, a woman with dragons turned in her bed. In the island's iron men muttered into their cups. On the road somewhere, a tall boy with a wooden face walked beside a girl who had learned other faces, and they paid a man to ferry them over a cold river. The night does not care for our little threads, but they cross and knot, and sometimes they hold. Weeks later, when the ravens came back with ink that froze in ropes at the end of their black strokes, the dead had moved from Eastwatch. Men had gone missing from little villages with names no one but the men who lived in them knew. Jon spoke to the hall and to the yard and to the men whose names he had learned and to the ones he would never learn. He saw in their faces much the same shapes he had seen on the field, the stubbornness, the fear, the greed and the courage and the pride, only cooled now by bread and a night's sleep. He said they would ride for Castle Black. He said they would leave a skeleton of men behind to keep the bones of Winterfell from being picked over by flights of ravens that had men's hands and names. Sansa stood and did not say goodbye like a sweet story. She said, "Do not do feats to please ghosts. Let the living be your work." He nodded because it had the tone of a thing he'd wish he had been told if he had not been told it. They saw him off in the yard. Rickon came with a half-made bow in his hand that some boy had taught him to string. He could almost draw it to his ear. He set it at his side, a promise to ask for teaching and take correction. He hugged Jon with a suddenness that made Jon drop a glove. "Come back," he said. "Come back even if you have to be a ghost. We will make you a place by the fire and all of us will pretend we can see you and tell you our jokes." Jon laughed in spite of himself. "I will come back with weight and wind and jokes if I can," he said, and thought he might be lying but was not sure to whom. When he rode out with the Vale Knights who had decided they liked a cause that gave their sharpness something to bite, and with wildlings who had already seen the dead and wanted revenge, he looked back once. Sansa stood on the battlement thickly wrapped. She lifted her hand. She did not call. She did not hiss warnings. She did not weep. He lifted his hand in return and turned his horse and let the world in front of him fill his eyes. On a long road, a lesson plants itself like a weed between paving stones and finds water and grows. That day theirs had been a feint, a way of making fear look like a banner and letting the enemy ride it to a place where they could be killed. It had worked because their enemy was greedy and proud, and because Jon had learned to put his pride in a pocket for an hour and take it out later and clean it and put it on and let it warm him as a good cloak does. In winter, a cloak is not a luxury. Winter fell. The days came slow and pale and short. The work was endless. The faces were too many. They carved names into wood and stone, sometimes only the names themselves, sometimes little faces with the smile lines that risk making a carving foolish, and they did it because it stiffened their own backs. Rickon practiced with his bow in the yard and learned to ride a small horse with a shaggy mane that had the temper of a farrier. He learned to put his fear into his hands and shape it, to be a Stark in Winterfell not because banners said so but because he was the boy that threw a shadow in the shape of the house. He called the maester by name and asked him questions, and he slipped once in the hall and said mother to Sansa, and Sansa put her hand over her mouth and nodded and said yes, all right. They did not become different from themselves because of one day's cleverness or one day's mercy. They became more themselves, which is harder. And sometimes at night, when the fire had dropped into a low rubble and the room was almost quiet and the snow outside was burning its beauty into everything, Sansa would think of the moment on that field when Jon had lifted his hand and tipped his palm and the horn had sounded and men had pretended to be less brave than they were long enough to be braver than any of them might have been if they had gone forward as fools. She would think that sometimes the game is the thing itself, and sometimes it is only the mask that lets us be the thing we must. She would look at Rickon asleep with ghosts snore like a saw near his ear, and think the gods had not always been cruel. That was enough to put her to sleep and carry her through to a morning that would ask for her voice again and her patience and her pride. Beyond the walls, in the land where the wind had teeth, dead things learned to listen for horns. They came on all the same. But that is a tale with its own dawn and its own gray, and when the time came and the night shoved its whole weight against the doors of Winterfell, the pack there was coiled and ready. They had learned patience. They had learned when to hold and when to fall back and how to pull a boy out of a straight-running line and put him on a horse and make him a promise. They had learned to pretend long enough to tell the truth with a blade. And that is more than most men carry into any night, no matter how long.